Ancient remnants of a time long past, the Dunmer strongholds of Morrowind were built in a time when the lands of Morrowind were still known as Resdayn, and before the great houses rose to power. Built to defend against foreign invasion, these fortresses today are an abandoned remnant of an era long past, occupied by bandits or orcs or creatures of the Sixth House, dungeons ripe for delving. And they're also the subject of today's mod of the day. For today we're showcasing the Northern Strongholds by Lord Zarcon, a dungeon overhaul mod that overhauls 6 out of the 11 Dunmer Strongholds in vanilla Morrowind. Specifically, as this name implies, this mod overhauls the interiors and exteriors of 6 of the Northern Dunmer Strongholds, expanding and adding new areas to these dungeons as well as new opponents through the face. And all in all, this covers the Dunmer Strongholds of Rotheran, Valenvaryon, Falasmaryon, Falensarano, Indoranyon, and Andasreth. Technically, some of these are fairly far south, but this mod specifically avoids Kogarun and Barandis, because both of those strongholds, already have some pretty popular overhauls for them, between Kogarun Expanded and Kogarun Extinct City of Ash and Sulphur, and, Sealoft's Barandis Overhaul. Now, the keen-eyed among you might recall that we showcased Lord Zarcon's Rotheran Overhauled way back in 2023. And that first overhaul is the kernel of sweet verticality that ultimately became the Northern Strongholds. We'll be taking a look at each of these Stronghold overhauls here today. And as a note, the Northern Strongholds has 2 options: an all-in-one package and a modular option. So you can pick and choose which Stronghold overhauls you want, in case there's a mod conflict or, a different overhaul that you might prefer. Not that there's that many overhauls for most of these locations, mind you. Delera 1000 did release better Dunmer Strongholds back in 2021, covering all the Dunmer Strongholds in vanilla Morrowind with modular options to pick and choose. But that overhaul only covered exteriors, and did not touch the Stronghold interiors. And some of the vanilla Dunmer Strongholds are, like many vanilla Morrowind dungeons, often just a bit empty, or even just a little bit copy and pasted feeling, if we're being honest. That's definitely not the case for the Northern Strongholds, as we'll see here in a bit. But let's kick things off with a closer look at the Dunmer Stronghold of Valenvaryon in the Northern Ashlands. This is arguably one of the more unique strongholds in vanilla Morrowind. Instead of being occupied by bandits or the Sixth House, it's instead the home of an orc colony, and it's one of the few orc-dominated locations in vanilla Morrowind. With a statue to Malakath in the center, and a number of domed exterior buildings, Valenvaryon is arguably just one of the most distinctive Dunmer strongholds in the vanilla game. Though, of course, the interiors do feel just a bit lacking. And here's the new and overhauled Valenvaryon. And right away you'll notice the terrain around Valenvaryon has been overhauled significantly, with new cliffs and outcroppings just lending an air of verticality. And also the ruined remnants of destroyed sections of this former Dunmer stronghold. You do kind of get the impression in the vanilla game that, maybe Valenvaryon was once a larger structure. And with the Northern Strongholds, you can see that visually. The main base has been fortified with palisades and makeshift defenses, and there's just a lot more detail in general, with small raised platforms to act as watchtowers and awnings to cover supplies. The basic layout is largely the same, with a couple of the original Dunmeri structures. But some of the other domes have been replaced with tints that just, arguably better fit the orcish aesthetic. It's a scenic transformation, That obviously blends in well, and is obviously compatible with other nearby mods, like the landscape overhauls of Blackgoo and Strider Burial, and of course the nearby Great Hive of Bad Beneath. And of course, the Northern Strongholds does overhaul the interiors of Valenvaryon. There's just not as much to see here though, because Valenvaryon is, I would say, a more exterior, stronghold than an interior one, especially compared to the other strongholds in Morrowind. But moving on, next we have Rotheran, the only Dunmer stronghold in the Shugorad region. We have technically showcased this one before, but for the sake of showing everything in one place, we'll show it again. In Morrowind, the stronghold of Rotheran is home to the famed Ice Blade of the Monarch, and there's even a couple of quests that send you here. There's an arena in the basement, and the bandits here hold fights for their own entertainment. That's a pretty unique setting. But the exterior, at least, is nothing more than a bog-standard Dunmeri stronghold, with nothing to really recommend it. And the interiors, aside from a pretty big battle and a unique premise, are kind of, just bare bones as well. Here is Rotheran from the Northern Strongholds, which is basically the same as what you saw in Rotheran Overhauled. The exterior layout has been noticeably improved, with heaps of sweet verticality. That's got my approval. 10/10 wood tower again. No notes. But, yes, the Rotheran Stronghold now has a much larger complex, with the propylon chamber merged into the greatest structure here, with scaffolding, platforms, cranes, and just various clutter showing that this stronghold is indeed inhabited. And of course, there's the tower, which has an accessible rooftop that provides some just truly jaw-dropping views of the Shugorad, and even the northern ashlands and grazelands. You can see the Tower of Telvoth from here, which I have to say is a pretty sweet win for verticality. And naturally, with a bigger stronghold, there's a lot of new areas to explore, with upper levels that include some living spaces, guarded by Atronachs, a new interior for the tower, with again some basic living spaces, and a completely revamped central arena. And now there's cages, holding cells for beasts, and an expanded chamber for the, let's call them contestants, I guess. You guys volunteered, right? Previously, they were all stuffed into tiny rooms, and now they've actually just got one big hall. They've got a little bit of breathing space. They can stretch their legs, as it were. In addition, there's also some new private quarters for the big bad bandit boss. The mage Rotheran Tyranno, holder of the Ice Blade of the Monarch, and it's all just very atmospheric. But let's just jump back to the Northern Ashlands, and the oft-forgotten brother fortress of Kogaroon, the Dunmer stronghold of Falasmaryon, located practically just right next door to Kogaroon, and likewise occupied by the Sixth House. From the exterior, in Morrowind, Falasmaryon doesn't really, look like much of anything at all. But going inside, there are a few unique enemies for you to face. And indeed, there is a House Rotheran quest associated with Falasmaryon. The stronghold itself has several interior cells, including a sewer complex. So it's actually just a fairly sizable dungeon in the vanilla game. If a wee bit unadorned, most of the rooms have no clutter or furnishings at all, just candles, so it's a very, very bare dungeon. The Northern Strongholds largely keeps the original exterior of Falasmaryon, but does add a couple new structures, including a tower to just tick off that verticality box, as well as ash piles and general cluttering, showing the effects of a long-abandoned stronghold so close to the ash storms of Red Mountain. Going inside, here is where the differences become just really evident. For these chambers, once unadorned, are just now more fully detailed, with shrines and altars, with offerings to the sixth house. Banners and statues and sinister red lighting. Stacked furniture, a hallmark of the sixth house, can now be found in several rooms that were just previously just bare of all furnishings. Cages housing corpus beasts, the victims of the blight, used for some foul experiment or other nefarious purpose. Some of these chambers have been completely replaced with new, larger spaces, providing an epic setting for battles with the masters of this six-house stronghold. From rooms lined with iron cells to balconies overlooking pools of lava, Falasmaryon has been transformed into a truly atmospheric and creepy dungeon delve. Far more memorable than, what was here before. Even the sewers have been given some new detail and cluttering, though perhaps to a lesser extent, compared to the rest of the dungeon here. Either way, it's a marked improvement. But, moving on, the Northern Strongholds overhauls both of the Dunmeri Strongholds in the Grazelands, including the decidedly unique Indoranyon. Though, as a note, this overhaul does conflict with Oak Grazelands. But as a reminder, the Northern Strongholds is modular, so, you can still use the other overhauls without conflict. But anyway, in vanilla Morrowind, there's not really a whole lot to Indoranyon's exterior. It has a propylon chamber, and an entrance, and that's it. Inside, though, Indoranyon is arguably just the most unique of the Dunmer Strongholds in vanilla Morrowind, featuring caves with Stronghold and Daedric ruins poking through. I always found these interiors to be, at least visually, quite intriguing, implying greater ruins to be discovered beyond the plain rock faces of the cavern walls. While visually intriguing, I was always more than a little disappointed that there wasn't more to find here, And strangely, for being a Dunmer stronghold, there aren't actually any stronghold sections for you to explore beyond these caverns, and no ruined chambers for you to delve through. This is rectified with the Northern Strongholds, as we'll see in a moment. But first, the exterior is largely similar to the vanilla game, only with a new dome and associated interior, and a bit more clutter and detailing with, awnings and signs of occupation. That new interior can be seen here. It's just, it's simple living quarters, presumably for whomever left the note on the door. Or perhaps, a Daedra worshipper that's taken up an interest in the ruins below. As for the main interior, the Northern Strongholds largely keeps a pretty similar layout to the vanilla game, with a mix of caverns and Dunmeri stronghold ruins. But now there's actually just a bit more actual stronghold elements here, with broken through walls that allow you to access the interiors of these stronghold ruins, with occasional side corridors and chambers. And of course, naturally, there's just a bit more cluttering and detailing. For like most vanilla game dungeons, the original Indoranyon was, just rather under-detailed. But speaking of Dunmer Stronghold ruins, there are new interiors here, with various quarters for you to find, largely inhabited by Daedra and Daedra worshippers, just extending this once rather short dungeon. And there's also a new shrine room, replacing the shrine to Maroon's Dagon with one to Mephala, complete with those creepy little spiders that Mephala is known for. Jumping down to the other major stronghold in the Grazelands, we have Falensarano. In vanilla Morrowind, the exterior here was just a pretty bog standard, two separate buildings. While the interior was divided into an upper level, home to a master trainer, and a lower level, populated by a variety of Daedra and hostile witches. Falensarano suffers from much the same fate as other Dunmer strongholds, with some just rather bare-bone chambers and corridors. But it also has some surprisingly fairly detailed areas of actual living quarters for the NPCs that occupy the stronghold. Certainly, it is just a lot more detailed in vanilla Morrowind than strongholds like, Falasmaryon, for example. You know, we just showed that one. And you've probably gotten these two confused at one time or another. You know, Falensarano and Falasmaryon do kind of, sound a wee bit similar. But in terms of detailing, Falensarano was just a lot more detailed in vanilla Morrowind. Now, here's the Northern Strongholds, which does make a few exterior adjustments, but largely keeps the same two-building layout. The biggest new addition here is a new barrier that goes around the main compound, including a gate that's guarded by shock traps that'll just fire bolts of lightning at you as you approach. There's also a new sort of greenhouse-type net around the roof of the main building, and a new shrine with a statue, which just gives you a hint as to the occupants of this Dunmeri stronghold. Looking at the interiors, the upper levels haven't really been changed too much. The living quarters for the Nord Master are just perhaps a bit more detailed. But it's the lower levels that have seen the biggest change. Previously empty space is now occupied either by small gardens, presumably used by the witches for ingredients or potions, or by shelves, atmospheric lighting, or dangling chains of skulls. And further down, there's some deadly traps for adventurers who wander too close to the witch's lair. The pit from the vanilla interior is still here, but now with actual piles of bones. A disturbing and gruesome, but somewhat atmospheric new detail. And for those that survive the pit, they'll find cages holding the skeletal remains of previous victims. And beyond that, a witch's lair, where all sorts of concoctions are no doubt being prepared. It's a really just quite creepy overhaul for a once neglected Dunmeri stronghold. But now we move on to our final overhaul, the Dunmer Stronghold of Andasreth in the West Gash. Originally a bandit stronghold, this location has been the subject of a past overhaul, namely by the 2019 mod Andasreth Stronghold Overhaul. But focusing on the vanilla stronghold here, Andasreth was actually fairly detailed in the vanilla game, with lots of furnishings, similar to other bandit-occupied strongholds. The rooms and general layout were arguably somewhat generic as far as strongholds go, but there was actually stuff to find here, compared to some of the other emptier strongholds in the vanilla game. But of that said, here's the overhaul from the Northern Strongholds. And in terms of the exterior, not too much is different. Most of the major changes are only on the upper level, where a makeshift watchtower has been built, along with a few gardens, just giving these bandits some self-sufficiency and advanced warning of would-be raids. Inside, each room has been given a more unique look. The vanilla stronghold had a lot of dedicated rooms, like what was probably meant to be a kitchen, or dining space, or living quarters. And the Northern Strongholds has largely kept the original intention of those spaces, while just expanding them and giving them more distinctive detailing. There's a room with a cooking fire pit, a room with bunk beds and hammocks for these bandits, and a central hall that appears to be in the middle of some sort of excavation. Some of the rooms have been just minimally changed, merely with some new furniture. While going down, you'll find entirely new areas, with a massively expanded lower level, consisting of upper level platforms and lower level living spaces, and also a new exterior entrance that leads to a dockside platform. All in all, the Northern Strongholds has transformed each of these locations into just more memorable dungeon delving experiences, with new traps, new enemies, and new encounters. With plenty of atmosphere, a healthy heaping dose of verticality, and new things to find, they're an excellent enhancement over the vanilla game. And, given that they are modular, you can just pick and choose depending on your compatibility preferences. But that's it for today's Mod the Day. So, as always, I've been your host, Golf Guy. And, real quick, I would just like to take a moment to thank our patrons for just making this video possible, including Aesthetic JMac, Alderolf, Alexos, Area 5/Sunball Billy Fighter, Carter Canterbury, Kiwi, Cyprinius, Danae, Daliant, Danina, Dennis418, Exovian, Yame Alcazo Castornau, Julian, Corridor, Langastir, Lord Brenny, Macbone, Melchior Dog, Mercury Bard, Merlord, Michael, Mr. the Joshman, Null Cascade, Old Navy Twidget, Operator Jack, or Mr. Bard, Porcuse, Povio Holo, Raven Talon, Arfuso, Rissa Leaf, Sand Gentleman, Shadowbanish Wine, Shooter, Circuit Cat, Stiff Kitten, Talvani with 8,000 nicknames, Tezrel, Two-Time Trauma Root, Tyra Rain, Voot Tot, and X0 Fox. If you'd like to join them, check out our rewards, including early access, behind-the-scenes content, access to polls and video previews. Visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/MorrowindModding. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe, stay healthy, happy modding, and I'll see you all next time.